I think all kids are interested in life and death. Like, I loved animals, I loved them dead, I loved them alive. If I saw a dead bird, I was fascinated. If I saw a live bird, I was fascinated. I think at a certain age, especially if you're a girl, you realize that's not seen as cool anymore. You're seen as creepy and disgusting. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I just never made that switch. My name is Joanna Ebenstein. I run a blog called Morbid Anatomy and the related Morbid Anatomy library. I'm also the founding member of Observatory, which is the arts and events space that the Midnight Archive is based on. My dad, I think he wanted me to be a boy, personally. He's never said that, but I think so. He would take me out into the woods and we'd turn rocks over, and I collected rocks and spiders, and I had a little natural history museum in my bedroom. And sometimes my animals would die. And my dad bought formaldehyde for me, so when I'm a very little kid, and so I had all my little dead animals, not cats or anything, but like lizards and snakes and stuff. The idea of duplicity is actually something I'm really interested in. I think the only objects that really draw me are complicated things that flicker on edges, so things that don't seem to go together. Beauty and death, that's not supposed to go together, and yet it does. Spectacle and edification. I feel like at heart that's kind of why these things, certain people they excite and make really fascinating, other people they freak out and they don't want to go anywhere near them. I think part of it is, do you enjoy being kind of existentially challenged or not? When I moved to New York in '99, I became really interested in photography. I think most people who move to New York get into either writing or photography. There just has to be some way to deal with all this new material. And I got increasingly into going to the Natural History Museum to photograph. And I was really interested in how objects in a museum, especially animals that were once living, become something totally else in a museum context. They become kind of like a word in an essay or a specimen as opposed to a bird that might have had a specific biography. When you look at natural history museums and then take that to a human subject, those problems are even more disturbing and pronounced and really interesting. And then I discovered a book called Stuffed Animals and Pickled Heads by Stephen Asma, and it's a history of natural history museums, and it's amazing, and it basically talks about the whole history of collecting, wet specimens, all of this stuff, and he talked about a lot of very early collections in Paris. So based on that book, I ended up going and photographing some of those collections and also the catacombs in France and that sort of thing. Morbid Anatomy, it's hard to explain what it is because sometimes I'm not really sure myself. I was doing a project in 2007 called Anatomical Theater, where basically I traveled to medical museums all around the world in order to photograph them and do an exhibition. And so I kind of came up with this idea of using some sort of a web-based something as a way to organize all my material. So that's how Morbid Anatomy, the blog, was born, and that was in 2007. I think a lot about the question of why people are so freaked out by death. I think death is the current taboo, where if the 19th century the real taboo was sex. So this whole idea of morbid anatomy, it's a double entendre, right? It's the opposite of normal anatomy. It means pathology, but also I've been called morbid my whole life for being interested in death. And at a certain point I just started to think, what's morbid about that? Why is it morbid to think about death? People argue all the time about what makes us human as opposed to animals. But the one distinction I think has not broken down is that I think human beings are uniquely aware that they are going to die. And the fact that we're not supposed to think about it or talk about it with any sort of dignified discourse, I find really perverse. Between the 1880s and the 1930s, some really major changes happened. Until then, people butchered their own animals. Good death was considered dying in the home, surrounded by your loved ones, and then the bodies would be laid out in the parlor. People would take photographs of the dead, as you know, memorial photographs or postmortems. And all of this kind of gets outsourced and disappears from view. So I feel like it's a luxury that death can even be something we don't think about, because death happens all the time, all around us. It just is invisible now. I started Morbid Anatomy not knowing where it was going to go. A few years later, after the blog became something of a success and I had been reached by a lot of people asking if I had this book or that book, and I really wanted to make my materials available to people. So I thought, okay, this is great. I have the studio space, I'll move all of my stuff down here, and thus the Morbid Anatomy Library was born. After that, we moved over to Observatory. Now I have the lecture and class series. I'm currently working on a photo book based on anatomical theater, which is basically about the art and history of medical museums, and I would love to do a Morbid Anatomy imprint where I publish other people's works. It's very nice to see a community forming. I feel like, and I'm glad it's been taken out of the internet world and into the real world. I love it. I love doing events at Observatory, and we have regulars now who know each other and they're friends outside of this, and it is very truly a community that involves everyone from scholars and medical museum curators down to artists and enthusiasts.